Ibn Taymiyyah said in Minhaj al-Sunnah, there's no doubt that whoever does not believe in the obligatory nature of ruling according to Allah's revelation and that of the Prophet ﷺ is a kafir, an unbeliever. And that if you rule by the sawalif or the adat, the customs, local customs and traditions, which is often done in the Badia, in the desert, or in the remote regions of the Islamic world, where people, instead of organizing their lives, they're Muslims, they organize their lives on tribal customs or local traditions, that if they know that this is not permitted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and yet they insist on doing so, that they are kafirs. If they say that it's permitted for them to rule according to tradition or custom, and not according to what was revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they're kafirs. And he's talking here about Muslims who pray and fast, but who in different regions of the Muslim world apply customs, for example in inheritance or in marriage or in other facets of life. That they are unbelievers. They're not truly Muslims, even though they're acknowledged by everyone today as Muslims, because their names are Muslim and they pray and fast. So if that is the case, that these simple people living in remote areas refuse to acknowledge Islamic law in place of their customs, then what about people who are living in the centers of Islamic knowledge, who are most familiar with all aspects of Islamic knowledge, who have access to the ulama at all times and places if they want to know the ruling of Allah in any particular aspect? All they need to do is call any of numerous great scholars, and yet they refuse to acknowledge that Islam governs, for example, interstate commerce. What is the hukum in that case? Clearly, the hukum of that is that they are unbelievers. So I think this matter, what is called as hakimiyya, should be clear to everyone. There's no doubt among scholars, there's no controversy, that hakimiyya is part of iman, that it's part of the faith of Islam, that it is a dangerous field to get into, questioning Allah's rule because you're dealing with being a Muslim or being an unbeliever. And yet, some people who have implied that in the study of Tawheed, or the study of the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that the study of al-hakimiyya is an important part of Tawheed, have been reviled and accused of innovating something in Islam. Tawheed, of course, is basically of two types. All aspects of Tawheed fall in two categories. The Tawheed, which is dealing with doctrine, acknowledgement of information and knowledge, Tawheed of knowledge, acknowledging Allah's lordship, acknowledging His divinity, acknowledging His names and attributes. That's one type of Tawheed. The other type of Tawheed is Tawheed of the irada wal qasd, the intention and the goal of doing various actions, that our intention is the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, al-uluhiyyah. All Tawheed is in these two forms. The ulama, in studying Tawheed, for aspects of research and understanding and clarifying the concepts to the students, have divided it in different ways. And nobody has said that there's one particular way of studying it. So, for example, they divide it into three categories. So they put, for example, rububiyyah and Tawheed al-Asma wa Sifat. That is the Tawheed of acknowledging Allah's existence and His being the creator and sustainer, Lord of the world. And the Tawheed of acknowledging His names and attributes. They put those as two separate categories, even though both of them deal with Tawheed al-Ma'arifah, which is Tawheed of knowledge, of information, doctrines. So there are different ways that you could organize the study of Tawheed, and some people have implied that al-Hakimiyya is part of that study. Perhaps they meant that it's a separate category of tawheed, or perhaps they didn't. But the important point here is that when mustalahat, or the technical terms in Islamic studies, theological terms, are invented by the ulama, and they evolve, and different scholars use different terms in different ways. And this is permitted by all the scholars. So some scholars call a particular thing, for example, let me think. Particular thing they may call an example of particular term that I want to think that's different in different madhahib. SubhanAllah. Well, for example, something is fard, something is wajib. Fard and wajib have similar meanings. In some madhabs they're used as two separate categories. In some madhabs they're used as one category. And all scholars acknowledge the legitimacy of these terms. In this century, terms have been invented. In previous centuries they have been invented and used to describe Islamic laws and beliefs. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's the same as when we translate Allah's lordship in the word Lord in English. We have not invented a new concept when we call Allah the Lord, when the Arabic word is Arab. We're using a word. Or if we say Salat is prayer, and then of course we describe prayer in its meaning. Salat in Arabic meaning has the meaning of dua, of invoking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, supplicating Him. But Islamic technical meaning is the specific rites of Salat as described in detail in Islamic law. So if we call Salat prayer, it doesn't mean we're changing the concept of Salat. We're using a different term for it. And we're saying that the Islamic prayer is the same prayer, the prayer which is performed in masjids in a certain particular way as described in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So there's nothing wrong with doing that. So if somebody puts al-hakimiyya, or the rulership of Allah, Allah's law, the superiority of Allah's law, and the obligation of ruling by Allah's law, as a concept of tawheed, that's clearly in harmony with what I just read from the opinions of all the different ulama. The tawheed, hakimiyya, or the rulership of Shari'ah, has to do with iman and kufr. Obviously, iman is part of tawheed, and therefore it's a legitimate concept. However, I do not talk about hakimiyya as being one category of tawheed. I prefer to talk about it very simply in those two categories of tawheed, underneath of which all these branches exist. So I'm really puzzled why people would be hostile to the discussion of al-hakimiyya, which is clearly discussed by the Sahaba and the early generations, and all the important scholars of Islam have discussed this concept that whomever does not rule according to Islamic law is a kafir. And it is such a serious concept that whoever denies that person is a kafir, by denying it, that person is a kafir, because they've denied, subhanAllah, Allah's law. Allah has revealed that this is kufr, and He's called it kufr. And as Ibn Taymiyyah makes clear, whoever denies it has denied the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And denying the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even one of them, is kufr itself, subhanAllah. So I think, and I would call on our brothers to be careful in making accusations against their fellow brethren, and be sure of what they're speaking of, because it only helps to put doubts and confusion in the minds of the ummah in matters which should be clear to everyone. Another important topic related to this is the idea of advice. That we must give advice to the rulers in how they rule. And this is based on the Sahih Hadith, of course found in Sahih Muslim. The Prophet ﷺ said, Adeen al-Nasiha. 3 times, he repeated it 3 times. Adeen al-Nasiha, Adeen al-Nasiha. Which means religion is, well, I don't want to translate Nasiha yet. Could be translated as advice, sincerity, good intent, a lot of things. I'll talk about its meaning shortly. And then they ask, to whom does this nasiha belong? And he answered, Lillahi wa rasulihi wa kitabihi wa rasulihi wa a'immat al-muslimin wa amatihim. The nasiha is directed towards, or the right of, Allah, His scripture, His messenger, the imams of the Muslims, and the common folk of the Muslims. Nasiha means the desire for good to the one to whom you're directing nasiha. The sincere desire for